Hello, this is Terry with Exact Line Tools. Today we're going to be doing a repair on a Toyota quarter panel. As you can see, I've already done some pre-pulls just to make sure that I could fix the quarter panel before I commit to it. For it did have some damage into the door jamb, as you can see, and it was fairly extensive. But I'm sure I can fix it, so let's move forward with this. You can see I'm pulling the panel in those low spots. I'm just using nails and a simple arrangement where I can pull it and tap it in, and I'm straightening it out a little bit more just to clean it up a bit before we get too deep into the mud work. Now we can see that I have to pull the inner wheelhouse that's detached itself from the outer quarter panel. It's usually held in there by 2 or 3 or 4 spot welds, which we will weld back up once we get it pulled into place. You can see where it overlaps right here, and I cleaned away the seam seal and I'm preparing it to weld. Okay, we've got that pulled out a little bit more. We still have a little bit more straightening to do, but we're getting closer. The panel is coming more into its original shape. It's still pretty rough. If we look underneath the wheel flare, we can see we've done the welding. So we have joined the two panels together, and I put a couple of spot welds in there to hold it in its place as it was originally. Here we have sanded and feathered out all of the paint all around the broken areas where the paint has been ground off, and we have cleaned up all of the metal, preparing it for the Bondo. And we've feathered back the paint on all the way up to the style line, so we can cover all of that and have good adhesion with the plastic filler. We've also replaced the door with a used one, so we could line it up and make sure that it fits perfectly. In this segment, I have placed a gapping board in between the rear door and the quarter panel. This is a cardboard, a single ply, non-corrugated cardboard that I insert that fits exactly the gap. It has masking tape on it so it releases, and I'm taking the extra plastic filler after filling that gap and just spreading it around in the low spots just so I don't waste the plastic filler. That is completely filled in now with a small gap that I'll fill right now after it's dried, and I'm done with that. And I'll put a little bit more plastic filler in spots that need it, like the bottom of the flare, which I welded and straightened. I just want to make sure I have enough plastic filler in there to round it and to make it a perfect shape, for I'll be using that as a guide to establish the style line on the flare. Now we're going to fill this entire area. I've masked off the flare and the door jamb, which I've sanded down the extra that I put on previously to establish the gap. Now I'm doing a test sweep over the main area of damage, pressing it onto the door to complete the contour. I'm applying the plastic filler all the way up to the style line at the top, making sure I get good coverage on all this area that needs to be filled and contoured. We do this step by step, and it makes it very easily. Now when you see I do my sweep, you'll watch my right hand pressing down onto the gray rear door, the used door, to create that contour, and pressing down on the other side of the quarter panel where the damage ends to complete the curving of the blade to meet it perfectly as it was originally. The first sweep kind of moves and organizes it and gets it fairly in place, but I do a few more just to make sure I get the sweep that I like. That looks pretty good so far. I'm going to put another sweep over that. I've removed the extra plastic from the blade, and now I'm doing another sweep, pressing down on the door and on the rear of the quarter panel to influence the curve in the blade. Now I'm going to clean it up a little bit and place some more plastic filler in the areas that are still needing plastic filler. I'm doing the bottom of the flare once again. It's really important to get this nice and smooth and a nice perfect shape to it, because I will be defining the upper part of the style line on the flare later using that area that I'm filling right now. But it must be contoured correctly with a nice natural curve to it, as a flare would have at the bottom where the pinch weld is. Now I'm just filling in the areas that are still in need of filler, building them up, removing the tape and going right up to the top of the flare. Trying to fill in as much as that as possible. I'm not too worried about getting it perfect just yet, but I'm building up to that point. And here I'm removing the excess from the rear side of the quarter panel where it gathered up after doing my first sweep. Okay, the plastic is beginning to dry, and you can see the surface has a nice shape to it. It does have some defects in the surface of it, but the overall shape of it has been established close to where we want to go. Now I'm doing the rear section. It was difficult to make one sweep to do it all, so I just do it in two separate applications. And I'll be using the blade, using a number 3 blade here, at a different approach, sweeping that right in there, joining with the first application that I did, getting a nice round curve. This area tends to curve in a little bit at the top, and it pushes out a little bit and towards the edge of the flare. So it's a unique shape that needs a little bit of special attention, and that's why we're doing it this way. Now I have some of those little areas that you saw that were little air spots and gaps in the plastic filler. I'm just filling that by doing a tight press of plastic filler on that area. Now I'm removing the tape so I can put a little bit more mud on that plastic on the flare to complete the fill in that area. I've got to remove that rest of that tape, and I can get under it with the squeegee there. Now I'm filling it up, and you can see that it's getting a little bit closer each time to being the shape that it was originally. Now here I'm going to do my first sand. I'm just knocking down the surface very lightly with 180 grit dry paper, It doesn't take long. You can see here it's 180 grit, which is a pretty fine paper, but we're not taking much off. Now there's a few surface blemishes that I want to correct, so I'm doing another sweep over this. As we do consecutive sweeps, the shape becomes more defined and more in alignment to what it should be based on the surrounding areas, which would be the door, the rear door, as one of my guides, and the other side of the quarter panel where my left hand is resting will give me a really beautiful radius that corresponds to the original shape that area had. Now I'm going to I'd let that cure, and I'm putting a second coat on the rear side of the quarter panel. Note I'm only doing one side at a time. It makes it easier for me to do it that way. You can see that the bottom of the flare I've sanded a few times. I'm still not happy with it completely, so I'm putting a little bit more plastic filler in there, and because it's very important that we have a perfect shape there, not only so it looks original, but also it gives me a line that I can rest my scribe in and define the flare up top, which you'll see in the next video. Here we're doing the sweep now of that area, and that looks real good. Cleaning up the flare a little bit, and a few little spots that still showed up on that area that I'm just doing a really tight pressing of plastic filler, not filling anything but the low spots in those areas, little air pockets and whatnot. Okay, we're looking really good here. I want to work on this flare a little bit, and here's the scribe that I'm resting up against that air portion that I've made nice and round at the bottom. That will guide me at the top of the flare to get a perfect shape based on that curve, so it'll always be the same width and follow the same contour. Simply do this with a very simple scribe, a pencil attached to a paint stick. Can't get any easier than that. I've backmasked it, and now I'm knocking it down again with 180 grit sandpaper. We do not apply a lot of plastic filler on here in terms of overfill. We remove it all when we do our sweep, and even though I didn't do a sweep here on the flare, I controlled it in such a way that I didn't get too much on there, so the 180 grit will knock it down pretty quickly. As you can see, it's taking shape. It's starting to look really good. There's some gaps in it that need to be filled. I'm not worried about that at this moment. I'm knocking it down just a little bit more, trying to get the surface flattened out. I only take it up as far as the tape, and now I'm doing some block sanding. This block is a hard block. It's straight, but it has a slight curve across the surface, so it gives me that little bit of curve that I can kind of roll it into that area, that portion up top that does have a slight inverted curve to it. And I just take it all the way over to the door gap, which is covered with tape at this moment, and I just knock it down right on up to the tape on top, which is the line where that style line begins. And I'll just work this a little bit, getting it nice and smooth in there. Now I'm taking my flexible block, which is basically a spring steel blade that I applied paper to, and it allows the blade to curve and gives me the ability to do an outward curve fairly straightforward in that area that I noted previously that pushes out a little bit. Now you can see I'm sanding right down to the tape, I've switched the tape from the outside of the style line to the inside of the style line, so I can sand right down to it and establish an exact line based on the line that I scribed earlier. You can see this sands down pretty quickly. Again, we're not dealing with a lot of overfill. I am not creating this shape. The blade created this shape. I'm just working the surface. Okay, now I'm using my block to sand the face of the flare. I want to get that nice and flat. And the only way I can get that way is with a hard block that's straight. And so I'm flattening out the face of the flare, and I'm sanding it right up to the line where the tape is, where I taped the mark that I scribed with the pencil earlier. This way I'm keeping track. I'm not over sanding, going past it. I'm staying within the parameters that I need to in order to maintain that line that I have carefully marked out with the pencil based on the style line on the door, which continues all the way to the bottom of the quarter panel. I'm sanding it down a little bit, again with 180 grit down on the dog leg here, just to kind of smooth out the surface. And by this time I've already established a exactly perfect gap, so I'm happy with that. I'm just working the outer surface of the flare at this point, just a little bit, wherever it needs a little bit. I'm going to put a little more plastic filler on there, but I want to get it as nice as possible. Clean up this bottom area a little bit with the DA and where the bumper fits, and a few spots a little bit here and there, and get it nicely knocked down so I can move forward with completing that. You can see above the tape line that there's some dark areas. Those are low spots, which I have filled, and I have done a very fine spread of plastic filler on the face of the flare, finishing that, and on above that 2 spots that I put a very light fill. Let those cure, and I've also cleaned up the inside of the door jamb on the quarter panel. Now I've backmasked that lower flare once again because I'm going to be sanding the upper portion, and I don't want to go past that style line, so I mask it off. And having just a look at it, you can see a few little spots in the plastic filler where there's air gaps and whatnot. We can fill those up very easily. Now, which I've done, I've gone over it, done a tightly pressed with just the spreader, and filled those up, sanded it down a bit, and prepared it for paint. And here we see the car after it's been painted. We can see the flare has a nice flat surface on it. The line corresponds perfectly with the rear bumper, as well as it corresponds with the rear door. The upper area has the shape that the car originally had, which is produced by tapping into that rear door that had no damage on it, and the rear portion of the quarter panel that was still somewhat intact. Everything else gets bridged over with the blade and takes on that shape precisely. Looks like a really great repair. Don't think there's going to be any problem selling this job. And if we look underneath the flare, we'll be able to see that we also took care of that area underneath and reapplied seam sealer in that area as to make it perfect and in original appearance also. A beautiful repair. Now you can do the same thing with the blade. And here we can see a quick view of the bottom of the flare just to show that it looks perfect and it's a great looking job. Order your blade online now. Thank you for watching this video.